Hello again, fellow YouTubers. I am Solomon Pleasant. Now, I haven't thought of any original opening for myself or anything like that, like any catchy thing or whatever, so you're stuck with that until I can think of something. Hopefully I find something. And welcome to my first upload where I am actually, in front of the camera doing something. And what are we doing exactly? We are going to review all 23 James Bond films. And hopefully the next two that come out, hopefully they come out in a time when I'm done reviewing the other 23. Hopefully. And we're going to go in chronological order, so we're going to start, and this is going to be our first episode, as it says up on the title. We're going to start with Dr. No. Now, this is the first James Bond film. The first one to come out, and I don't necessarily know the book's order or anything. The books are like the third most memorable thing about the whole James Bond franchise. Number 2 being video games, you've seen those, and number 1 being the movies, the one thing that everybody remembers. So, Dr. No, the first James Bond film, and here's what I'm going to be doing. I am not necessarily going to be reviewing the actual movies, because I think people have done that. I'm going to rate them. Now, obviously, all James Bond films are masterpieces and are all 5-star films, obviously. And for those of you who don't believe that, I'm watching you. So, I'm going to basically rate these of how they are out of 10 stars. Ooh. So, for those of you who disagree with me, you could consider this as how these films would do if they weren't being rated out of 10, if they were just being rated out of 5. So like a 9 would be a 4, a 10 would be a 5, and so on. And here's what I'm going to be doing. First category is story/plot and whatnot. How does the story really hold up? Number 2 is scenery. How does it look as a film? How does it work? Number 3 is follow-up, which is how does it compare to its predecessor? How does it compare to that? Number 4 is its theme music. How does its opening credit theme do to serve the movie? Now, I know that there are some that most movies have most of the Bond films have end credits scenes that have songs that are completely different, and I'm going to be doing my rundown of all the Bond film themes, in which I will give honorable mentions, just to name one now, Surrender at the end of Tomorrow Never Dies. And the 5th category is going to be probably what I consider the most important one of the most important ones other than story, the characters. How do the characters hold up in the film? So, having that said, let us dive right into James Bond in Dr. No. So, our first category, plot/story, whatever you want to call it. And the gist of it is, after an MI6 agent disappears in Jamaica, James Bond is sent there, and he finds out that this agent was killed, and also finds out that this agent was investigating a particular man by the name of Dr. No. Already, that sounds like spoofs everywhere can be easily made out of that. And as he learns more about Dr. No, and Dr. No is really built up, and I'll explain in characters how that may or may not work, he then finds out that Dr. No is on an island called Crab Key, in which he goes to investigate, finds the first Bond girl ever. I'm getting ahead of myself. Characters are way in the end of the review. And basically he finds out Dr. No's plan, which is to topple the entire U.S. space program. Now, as a story, I find this very original, especially as a spy flick story, because when you think about it, most spy films come down to one of these few methods. A, the mastermind has a death ray. B, some people have hijacked nuclear missiles. Or C, someone that the spy is close to has been kidnapped and they're going to find that kidnapper. And then there's drugs at number 4, and number 5 is where we get these original plans. And this is one thing I have to commemorate the Bond films for. they have pretty original stories for most of the time. And even when they take the old nuclear missile thing, that's the one that they take the most, they make it original, which I find really good, but I digress. The story for Dr. No, I think, is actually pretty well done, and while I find it very weird that the locals consider Crab Key haunted, and that there's like a tank that's actually that they think is a dragon or something, I find that just a little bit odd, but for most of the film, it does well, and when I explain more in characters, but the story builds up for other Bond films that come after it, and we'll get to the third category later. So, all in all, the story itself gets a star, because I think it's a pretty original story, actually. So, 1 point for the story. Now we get to our second point, the scenery. Now, I also like the scenery in this film. First, Jamaica looks very nice. It looks very nice and well set out. It looks like a Jamaican era. You got like some black people there, you got some white people there, you have multiple types of people there. And the scene where they're at the bar looks very Jamaican as well. I'm not trying to be offensive at all on that. Crab Key looks very nice and at the same time a little bit chilling because there is a lack of people that you see on the island. And Dr. No's base looks really nice. I'm gonna be flat out honest. His base looks cool. And he even has like this whole hotel setup thing that he puts Bond and the Bond girl in. And they're kind of like captive guests, but at the same time they're glorified captive guests because they're in this nice hotel setup and it just looks really nice, which adds to the, who is this guy? And I'm just going to come out and talk about the dinner scene that Bond has with Dr. No, and it looks really nice. Granted, the way some of the stuff looks for the time being of the film and when it was made is kind of set back, but all in all, it looks very nice. And the laboratory where Dr. No is getting ready to ready his radio beams that will topple the U.S. space program look, while bland to some people, to me it looks very original. It looks like a place where people would be working. And it looks very believable almost. So, scenery also gets a star in my book because it did a good job, I think. And now on to follow-up. Okay. This is kind of cheating. Because this was the first Bond film. So I guess you could say, how does it follow up to the books, or, well, the video games haven't been invented yet for them. But on its own, it does really nice, I think. It introduces Bond in a good way. It introduces our characters in a good way. And I think, for the most part, it gives the other films something to kind of rival to, because when this was first came out, it looks really good, actually. So this is kind of cheating, but for follow-up, it also gets a star. Wow, already 8 stars, and we have 2 categories left. How nice. 4th category, the theme music. Y'all know it's coming. Y'all know. And I'm gonna be brief about this, but the theme music gets a star. It's the original Bond theme. You can't say anything bad about the original Bond theme. Now, I know the opening credits also has some other lively stuff and whatnot, but that's not the thing people remember, and that's not the thing I'm gonna look at. Because when I purchased the tracks, the 50th year anniversary special, all 22 tracks to Bond, and then I've got Skyfall, which we'll talk about that later. So all 23 song tracks, which one is on there for Dr. No? The original Bond score, the original Bond theme. Yeah, it sounds good. And it's the original James Bond theme. What else can you say? Star. And now we get to characters. Let's go over them. First, James Bond is played by Sean Connery. That is brilliant. Sean Connery is amazing. And I'm going to come out and say this, Sean Connery is hands down the best Bond. Pierce Brosnan gets a close second, Roger Moore gets a really close third. He almost makes sense second, but Pierce Brosnan's just a little bit better. And then you got Sean Connery, you got Pierce Brosnan, you got Roger Moore. In fourth, you got Daniel Craig, thanks to Skyfall. In fifth, you got Timothy Dalton and George Lazenby. We'll talk about him later. But you got Sean Connery as James Bond. That's good. That is really good. He does well, and he just acts really well. Next, let's talk about the Bond girl. Well, before we talk about her, let's talk about the people at MI6. You got M, who looks like M, even though he doesn't really do much. You got Moneypenny, who is... It's pretty nice to see Moneypenny for the first time, and after a while you'll see her more often, because she's that quirky love interest, but yet never gets him in the end. And there's no Q in this one. Yeah, that kind of sucks. There's no Q in this one, so that kind of downgrades it a little bit. And then there's some other people that you don't remember. Next, let's get to the Bond girl. Here's one of the film's problems. You introduce Honey Rider, the first Bond girl. This is the first Bond girl. And you introduce her when? In the third act of the movie? I'm not sure if you had this thinking cap on when you were considering that. Maybe it's because, well, we didn't think Bond girls were going to become a custom thing. We just felt like put it in this one, but come on. Really? The third act, I mean, they tried to develop some sort of character with her, but I really just don't see that. I just see her as that girl who's just there for Bond to bang once it's over. She's just there for Bond to rescue, win over her affection, and then bang later. That's all she's really there for. And granted, when she comes out of the pool, yes, that's a stunning scene. That is gold, because that's a pretty stunning scene. But still, the character itself is kind of bland, kind of forgettable. Let's go on to the henchmen. Another problem with this film. Now, there were like 3 major henchmen in this film that helped with Dr. No, besides all the guards that just get killed instantly. You got this camera girl who gets arrested. I do not remember her. Bond bangs her, and then she gets arrested. That's pretty much it. She has a camera, takes some pictures, but not much. So, not that memorable. Next, you got the 3 blind mice, who I think these characters could have had a lot of potential if they actually had lines. They really don't have that many lines. I mean, it's a good concept. 3 pretend blind guys who try to kill Bond. Granted, they don't have any lines. I'm okay with that, but they're disposed of in a really simple way. They just fall off a cliff, the car blows up, and then Bond says, "Oh, hey, must have been late for a funeral." That's classy, but still. They're kind of forgettable henchmen as well. The only henchman that I really remember from this film was Professor Dent. I hope I'm saying that right. I believe it was Professor Dent. And he tries to kill Bond himself. Goes in there, shoots that dummy, then Bond just kind of sits there, chillax, and it's just like, "Oh, hey, I saw you try to kill me. That's a nice gun you have there. It's a shame that it only has 6 shots, and you fired all 6 shots. Bang, bang, you're dead." That was kind of memorable, actually. Now, granted, they try to kill Bond first with a tarantula. This was made before science was at its toppest game, so you got that. But this is the most memorable of the henchmen, which is sad because he doesn't do that much and gets killed in, again, a very simple way, though Bond gives a memorable one-liner. And before I get to the main villain, I'm going to talk about the other little sidekicks that Bond has. Felix does okay. He only plays a small part. There's this one, excuse me, bar dude that I don't remember the name. I remember his name being inappropriate. I remember that. And then you got Quarrel. I liked Quarrel. He was cool. He was cool. And then he dies by burning alive. Now that's kind of genuinely sad. It's a shame it's a shame that they just throw him out and give him such a simple death. Which will happen to a lot of Bond's friends for most of the films. But aside all that, sidekicks, Quarrel's pretty good, Sean Connery's good, Dent's okay, Honey Rider is eh, the other henchmen are forgettable, there's no Q. Let's talk about the villain. Dr. No. This name has caused so many parodies in God knows where, but this name has caused so many parodies because of how simple it is. You could look up Dr. No parodies and it'd be like that. But let's talk about the actual character. Dr. Julius No. Now, he explains that he's a member of Spectre. Thank you, Dr. No. You now have set the premise for... what? 5 other films at least? You've set the premise for 5 James Bond films at least. Thank you. And he's a member of Spectre, and he has robotic hands. That's kind of cool. I mean, at the time, I guess that all they could afford was put black gloves over his hands. I guess that's okay. The main problem I have with Dr. No, real quick, though. Like Honey Rider, he's only seen the 3rd act. But unlike Honey Rider, he's only shown in 2 or 3 scenes. Not using this thing again, guys. You weren't using this thing again. Granted, the diner scene being one of them is a really good scene and a genuine scene. It's still only one scene, and then he's seen in the laboratory with the final fight with Bond. That's glanced over pretty quickly, so he only gets one scene to define his character. Granted, he does a good job at defining his character. He's a cold person. But, again, only 2 scenes? Really? The villain. They build this villain up through the entire movie like he's just some really, really big baddie, and he comes off, and he's not even in the top 5 Bond villains. No, he's just an average villain because you don't give him enough screen time. He only has 2 scenes. You build this guy up, and then it's just like, oh, yeah, there you go. What the heck? What the heck, guys? 2 scenes? Just, that was not a smart move. It just wasn't. His acting, the guy who plays him does really well. He's just this cold doctor that is just kind of no nonsense, and I will crush you if you get in my way. I never fail. And he's just really cold. And I think that plays to his advantage. Now, his final fight scene with Bond, I think, is underplayed a lot. They could have gone out so much with this, but I think with the time being... they just tried to do with it the best they could and tried to stay original to the book, I think. And as a result, he gets killed pretty easily. He falls into a pit of radiated water, and his hands partly cause his downfall because he can't grab onto anything, which you think he would be able to with those hands' strength, but I don't bother questioning it. It's a Bond film. And you think his hands would have been a better weapon. You think when he punched Bond would have been like, oh, jeez, that almost broke my jaw. Those hands were made of metal. But he's cast aside pretty well. He's a pretty memorable villain, I think. Granted, he's not, like, up there with the top 5 villains, but he's at least in the top 10 because he's part of Spectre, so he does pretty well, I think. All in all, though, Connery's good, Dr. No is good, Quarrel is good, and then we got, like, 2 okay, and then there's a bunch of forgettable stuff, so there's just too many forgettable characters to help the good characters be really good. So because of that, I give characters a half a star. Because, again, there's just too many forgettable ones. So, all in all, this film gets a 9.5 out of 10. It comes really close to being a 10-star film. The one thing that kills it for me, though, is just, again, the forgettable characters. And that's the main reason why this doesn't get a 10-star rating. And also because, yes, the stuff was... the, like, movie-making skills were the best at the time. I mean, when you look at, like, Skyfall now compared to Dr. No, well, duh, Skyfall's better, but Skyfall just has more stuff to work with. And Dr. No was made in, I don't know, the 60s, 70s? 19-something, when films were still at a time where computers weren't used that much. So you can't really shut it for that. Dr. No is not in my top 10 list, but it's really, it gets really close. And granted, it's kind of vanilla, I will say that, and the only time I generally would watch it if I'm doing a whole Bond marathon, which is where you watch them all, and yeah, you have to start with Dr. No. And granted, if you're, for a first-time Bond person, you can say two things. One, you can start with any particular film, in which I'd point them to a different film, which I will talk about later. Or you can say, oh, you can watch them all in order. Start with Dr. No. That is the first film. It's the first James Bond film, so it gets some slack. So all in all, Dr. No gets a 9.5 rating. Well, I think that works well for a first review, I think. And this is Solomon Pleasant saying, I will see you next week when we are reviewing which one? Oh, From Russia with Love. Okay. This is Solomon Pleasant, signing off.